how excess turned into a psychological weapon. Excess was once considered reckless, wasteful, a sign of poor judgment disguised as wealth. But at the highest levels of power, excess was re-engineered. It stopped being indulgence. It became intimidation. Today, some of the most deliberate decisions are the ones that look irrational. And among elite sheiks, excess is rarely accidental. To understand why this matters now, we need to separate spending from signaling, because excess was never about enjoyment. It was about perception. Historically, restraint was admired. Efficiency implied intelligence, but restraint also implied limits, and limits invite challenge. When power wants to appear unreachable, it removes the appearance of boundaries. Excess does that instantly. When resources are deployed far beyond necessity, observers stop calculating trade-offs. They stop asking what something costs. They start asking how deep the reserves really are. That uncertainty creates hesitation. In negotiations, hesitation is leverage. The sheiks learned this early. They watched how extreme displays shifted behavior without confrontation. Competitors softened positions. Critics recalibrated ambition. Excess changed the psychological terrain. A purchase too large to justify implied confidence beyond rational calculation. A project too grand to explain suggested immunity to consequence. This was not chaos. It was choreography. Every visible excess pushed perception further, further from reason, further from measurement. When actions stop fitting logic, opponents lose reference points. And without reference points, strategy collapses into caution. But excess is dangerous. Used carelessly, it invites backlash. Used constantly, it becomes noise. So among the most powerful, excess was applied sparingly, precisely, at moments when perception mattered most. This transformation turned spending into psychology, luxury into theater, the irrational into influence. But the weapon had a flaw, because when excess becomes expected, its power fades. And that is where the real tension begins. As excess became visible, it attracted imitation. Others copied the displays. Projects grew larger. Spending escalated. What once shocked, slowly normalized. This dilution threatened the weapon itself. When everyone spends extravagantly, excess stops communicating dominance. It becomes background noise. The sheiks recognized the danger early. They understood that excess only works when it disrupts expectations. So the strategy shifted. Excess was no longer constant. It became episodic, deployed at inflection points, then withdrawn completely. Silence followed spectacle. This created contrast. After a massive display, restraint felt intentional. Observers recalibrated assumptions. They questioned whether the excess was merely the visible fraction of something larger. That uncertainty restored leverage. Excess also changed form. It moved away from personal luxury toward systemic scale. Instead of yachts, infrastructure. Instead of jewels, city-shaping projects. Instead of consumption, control over environments. These displays were harder to imitate. They required coordination, not taste. Patience, not impulse. Excess became institutional. This amplified its psychological impact. It suggested permanence, not indulgence. Capacity, not impulse. But the deeper effect was emotional. Excess overwhelmed rational analysis. When scale exceeds comprehension, people stop evaluating details. They surrender to assumption. Assumption is fertile ground for power. Yet even this refined weapon had limits. Because the larger the display, the greater the expectation that follows. Each act of excess raised the bar. Eventually, restraint itself could be misread as weakness. The weapon now demanded precision. Too much and it collapses. Too little and it disappears. The balance narrowed, and maintaining it required a deeper understanding of how fear, awe, and uncertainty interact. That understanding would be tested when excess met resistance. From a world growing skeptical of spectacle, the conflict surfaced when spectacle stopped guaranteeing compliance. Audiences grew cynical. Critics questioned intent. Excess began triggering resistance instead of hesitation. What once overwhelmed now provoked analysis. Governments asked about sustainability. Markets questioned efficiency. Public opinion reframed excess as vulnerability. This was dangerous because excess only functions as a weapon when it feels effortless. The moment it looks forced, it signals insecurity. The sheiks face a dilemma: retreat and appear constrained, escalate and confirm suspicion. Neither option preserved advantage, so the weapon evolved again. Excess stopped announcing itself. It embedded into systems. Projects appeared functional, but were scaled beyond necessity quietly. The message changed. Instead of saying, "We can afford this," excess implied this is routine. That subtle shift restored intimidation. When massive undertakings looked casual, observers stopped questioning capacity. They assumed depth beyond visibility. This reframing neutralized skepticism. At the same time, visibility narrowed. Only select audiences saw the full scale. Others saw fragments. Enough to sense magnitude, not enough to measure it. This selective exposure reintroduced uncertainty. Fear does not require clarity. It requires ambiguity. But ambiguity must be controlled. Too much invites disbelief. Too little invites challenge. The psychological weapon now relied less on shock and more on calibration. Every display was timed. Every silence was intentional. Every retreat prepared the ground for the next advance. Excess had matured. It was no longer a blunt instrument. It was precision pressure. And like all refined weapons, its power peaked just before it needed to be used. That moment was approaching because the world was about to test whether excess still commanded hesitation or merely attracted scrutiny. The climax arrived quietly, not in scale, but in restraint. The most powerful use of excess was choosing when not to deploy it. When the world expected escalation, there was calm. When critics waited for spectacle, there was efficiency, and that absence spoke louder than any display ever could. This was the realization. Excess was never meant to dominate constantly. It was meant to redefine the baseline. Once perception had shifted, maintenance replaced performance. The weapon had done its work. Fear no longer came from what was shown. It came from what might be possible, from the memory of scale, from the uncertainty of limits. That uncertainty lingered, because when observers cannot tell whether restraint is choice or necessity, they default to caution, and caution preserves power. Excess, in its final form, was no longer about spending. It was about optionality, the ability to deploy overwhelming scale, or ignore the moment entirely, to respond massively, or not respond at all. That freedom is the true signal. The resolution is subtle, but decisive. Power does not need to impress continuously. It only needs to remind others. That escalation is never off the table. Once that reminder is established, silence does the rest. This is why excess still matters, even in an age that claims to value restraint. Because excess, when understood properly, does not exhaust itself. It conditions behavior. It shapes decisions before conflict appears. It softens resistance before negotiation begins. It turns uncertainty into leverage. What began as indulgence completed its evolution as strategy. And today, the most effective psychological weapons are the ones rarely used, but never forgotten, because the greatest power is not what you display, it is what others believe you are capable of. How